The way that companies evaluate their greenhouse gas emissions is there's a approach for doing corporate reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And it involves first what we call Scope 1 emissions, which are direct greenhouse gas emissions from company-owned facilities or vehicles, okay? So let's use MIT as an example. MIT has a cogeneration plant where we burn natural gas to generate steam, heat, and chilled water. So that's Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions associated with electricity consumption. So we know how much electricity we buy at MIT, we know what the carbon intensity of the grid is. It's fairly straightforward to be able to estimate those Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are everything else, and we call those value chain emissions. And those are associated with what we call purchased goods and services. So everything MIT buys that comes onto campus, computing equipment, lab equipment, office supplies, like those are all part of our Scope 3 footprint. And then for companies that make things and sell them to their customers, and if the customers use them and there's emissions associated with them, say a smartphone producer or a laptop producer, the use of those products is also part of Scope 3 emissions. So when it comes to developing, let's say a company, or MIT for that matter, sets a net zero target, the priority and kind of the consensus best practices is that you do as much as possible to reduce your emissions. So at MIT, we've set a goal of being fossil fuel free by 2050. And that means we need to think of solutions for how else are we going to generate this steam and chilled water and heat on our campus without using fossil fuels. So there are some technical challenges associated with that. With companies that manufacture things, they have to do the same thing for the facilities that they own. And then what a lot of companies are doing is they're working with suppliers to directly decarbonize their operations as well. So for a company that's manufacturing things, they will work with their suppliers to be able to decarbonize their operations through purchases of renewable energy. And they may actually try and develop guidelines for customers to use their products in ways that use less greenhouse gas emissions. They go through all of that. In most cases, they won't be able to get to absolute zero. And so what they do then is look outside of their value chain to invest in projects that will reduce CO2 emissions, thereby offsetting some of the emissions that they still have. And that's what a carbon offset is. Now, these voluntary carbon markets are where basically an entity can say, hey, I would like to offset 1,000 tons of CO2 emissions. What kind of projects are there that are available? And there are people who are running projects that sometimes involve natural carbon sinks, like forestry projects or agriculture projects, where they say, hey, like this forest was going to be chopped down, but if you invest in this project, we won't chop it down, and you will then get credit for having offset this amount of CO2. And you can then report that to your stakeholders that you have invested in these offsets. Another example is a lot of agricultural practices release a lot of carbon from the soil. It turns out there's more carbon in the soil than there is in the above ground trees and plants. And so we need to shift to what we call regenerative agriculture practices to try and keep that soil in the ground. But to do that requires farmers to change practices, to take some risks for a few years. And so if we can get investments to them to basically say, hey, let's change your practices so that that carbon stays in the ground, that can be accomplished through voluntary carbon markets. But there's been some controversy recently because sometimes it's hard to prove what we call additionality, which is basically like, would this effort have taken place without this investment? If the answer is yes, then you shouldn't be getting credit for having those reductions. And And then also, how can we verify that this is going to be a durable investment? Meaning, like, what if the forest burns down, and when it burns down, it releases all kinds of CO2? And so there are some technical questions around how do we measure CO2 emissions in these natural spaces, both in the soil, in the carbon, and then also in forests. And then how do we scale up those estimates? It turns out a lot of carbon measurements in soil are time consuming and costly. Can we use things like remote sensing from satellites or drones to be able to improve our estimates of what kind of carbon is in the soil and what's the potential for investments? And so it's kind of a fascinating problem, because you have to rely on those scientists and engineers to improve these estimates and computational methods to be able to scale them up. But of course, we need those voluntary carbon markets and the climate finance to be able to invest in them. And then we need the corporate and government world to have trust in those offsets that they're really doing what they say they're doing. And so they all play into reducing CO2 emissions, but also in the ways that companies talk about efforts that they're using to reduce their CO2 emissions.